Now, Biden hit Trump for promising to extend the 2017 tax cuts beyond 2025 when many of those provisions are in fact set to expire. And it would essentially deprive the federal government of $700 billion over the next 10 years. I have to get something off my chest. It's been on my mind since yesterday. Can I get it off my chest? You ready? He has no idea what's coming. Okay.
No, I don't.
Yesterday, we did a story about what would happen if Trump gets elected and he further extends tax cuts for the rich, right? But I've gotten to a point where I don't trust government, Cenk. Whether it's a Democrat in charge or a Republican in charge, I don't trust government. So in that analysis that we did and talked about, one of the tax breaks that came with Trump's tax cuts for the rich, if he extends it, it would lead to $700 billion in lost revenue for the federal government. So what? So what? What does the federal government do with our money? $700 billion for what?
Today, I want to discuss Ana Kasparian's realization about federal taxes and spending. First, I'm going to discuss the tax cut that blew Anna's mind. And second, I want to clarify the breakdown of federal spending so everyone knows where their taxes are going. Please like and subscribe. I'll be responding to any comments as well. I have a background in tax law and I'm about to nerd out.
Now, Biden hit Trump for promising to extend the 2017 tax cuts beyond 2025 when many of those provisions are in fact set to expire. And among them is the so-called pass-through businesses, which aren't taxed because the profits flow through the owners who are individually taxed.
So Anna tosses it over to Cenk for an explanation of this, but I'm going to insert my own. I'll keep this simple and make it quick. There are essentially two types of business entity for tax purposes, a corporation and a pass-through. The income of a corporation is double taxed, meaning it is taxed when the corporation receives it and then taxed again when it is paid out to the shareholders as dividends. Unlike a corporation, a pass-through is not taxed when the entity receives income. Rather, the income is passed through to the owners each year based on their agreement. The major types of entities that are treated as pass-throughs are sole proprietorships, various types of partnerships, limited liability companies or LLCs, and S corporations despite the name. There are a variety of reasons why you would choose one entity over the other. I will add that there is nothing nefarious about treating these entities differently for tax purposes. These options exist to help people form different types of business structures, and the tax laws are just trying to tax these business structures accordingly. In 2017, there were tax cuts provided to corporations and pass-throughs. Anna is about to discuss a report about the tax cut on pass-throughs, which I will elaborate on after.
So the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities did an analysis to see how much it would cost the federal government if there's an extension of the tax cut for pass-through businesses. And it would essentially deprive the federal government of $700 billion over the next 10 years. So look, I have no doubt that if Trump gets reelected and is the next president, he will succeed in extending the tax cuts.
Anna is referring to a report by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which I am going to call the Center. The tax cuts on pass-throughs expire at the end of 2025, and there is a discussion about whether to extend them. The Center claims that extending the tax cut on pass-throughs would cost more than $700 billion over 10 years. To support this claim, they cite their own analysis of numbers put out by the Congressional Budget Office, who estimated the effects of extending the 2017 tax cuts. I could not find any information about the Center's analysis, so I looked at the CBO's publication and supplemental data. Based on the CBO's estimates, I can see how the Center got to a $700 billion figure. The tax cut for pass-throughs expires after 2025, so a 10-year extension would be from 2026 to 2035. The CBO only provides figures through 2033, so my guess is that the Center assumed an increase of about $2 to $3 billion per year for 2034 and 2035. This would be consistent with the increases estimated by the CBO for the years they covered. You can see on the screen how this comes out to about $711 billion over 10 years. So I think this report by the Center warrants some discussion. The two main points I want to make are how much is $711 billion over 10 years, and what are we getting for this money? On the first point, I would look at this annually as $71 billion per year. Economically speaking, you can consider this tax cut to be the same as government spending because it is money that would have been in the hands of the government. So for context, federal outlays in 2023 were $6.1 trillion. This means the tax cut on pass-throughs is valued at a little over 1% of federal outlays per year. So what are we getting for this particular tax cut? On the upside, a lot of businesses benefit from this deduction. The Joint Committee on Taxation reported that in 2019, there were almost 40 million business tax returns, of which more than 38 million were for pass-throughs. Without getting too in the weeds on this, the point is that the vast majority of businesses in America are pass-throughs. On the downside, this tax cut benefits higher income taxpayers more than lower income taxpayers. I want to explain the reason for this. The tax cut for pass-throughs was added in 2017 basically out of fairness because there was going to be a significant cut to the corporate tax rate. Given that pass-throughs are not taxed at the entity level, Congress could not simply cut a tax rate like they did for corporations. So, Congress decided to provide a 20% tax deduction against most income received from pass-throughs. A deduction is not the same as lowering tax rates and results in a larger benefit if you earn more money. That is, the deduction is more valuable as your tax rate increases. There are certain caps in place on how much of a deduction someone can take, but the point is that this tax cut on pass-throughs is a bit regressive. Next, I want to briefly discuss Anna's concern with where her tax dollars are being spent because a lot of people do not know how the federal budget is broken down.
But I've gotten to a point where I don't trust government, Cenk. Whether it's a Democrat in charge or a Republican in charge, I don't trust government. So in that analysis that we did and talked about, one of the tax breaks that came with Trump's tax cuts for the rich, if he extends it, it would lead to $700 billion in lost revenue for the federal government. So what? So what? What does the federal government do with our money? $700 billion for what? For more aid to other countries in the form of weaponry? Is that what it is? Which is basically just redistributing our money from taxpayers to weapons contractors and defense contractors.
Yeah, so
it bothers me. I can't sit here and talk about like, oh, the federal government needs more revenue when I've seen what they do with our revenue, Cenk. At some point, the arguments made, look, I'm not libertarian, you guys know that, but the argument of taxation is theft starts to resonate. Because
under this government,
because you see how much gets taken out of your paychecks and you see your quality of life dwindle away year after year, election cycle after election cycle. I'm supposed to sit here and get real upset that the federal government doesn't have the kind of revenue that it could if they just tax us more and tax wealthy people more. What are you gonna do with the money? Are you gonna actually fight for policies that are gonna improve the lives of Americans? And so far, I have not seen much of that happen. Also, we can just point to gridlock and say that we can't work together, we can't get any bills passed. So we do nothing for the American people as they continue collecting our taxes, by the way, and as they continue funneling that revenue and those tax dollars to all sorts of things that Americans are actually overwhelmingly against, like including military aid or providing military aid for wars abroad.
First, Anna's rant is epic and totally worth watching in its entirety. It's linked in the description along with all the other sources. Second, let's talk about how much of the federal budget goes toward defense. As I mentioned earlier, total federal outlays in 2023 were $6.1 trillion. Of that amount, $805 billion went to defense. As you can see from this infographic, more than half of the budget is dedicated to mandatory spending, which includes things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I often hear misleading statements about how defense spending is half of the budget, but this is only true of discretionary spending. The difference between mandatory and discretionary spending is beyond the scope of this video, but suffice it to say that it's misleading to discuss discretionary spending in isolation when talking about the federal budget as a whole. Also, I am not trying to argue that the spending breakdown is good. I just want to make the point that defense spending is not as large a part of the budget as people think it is. Most of America's spending is actually on social safety nets and other programs. Let's end on a point that Anna makes, which I think most people would agree with.
Listen, if we had a well-functioning government that actually utilized those tax dollars to improve the lives of Americans, I would feel even more strongly against extending the tax cuts for the rich. But I can't help but think about what the government does with that money, and it makes me absolutely furious.
Preach, Anna. Preach.